Every global reserve currency in history followed the same arc. It rose with power, expanded with trade, and collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. The Spanish silver dollar dominated world commerce for centuries before confidence evaporated. The Dutch guilder ruled global finance until debt and war eroded its foundation. The British pound appeared permanent until fiscal reality intervened. Each collapse was not sudden, but structural. Today, the United States dollar is exhibiting the same historical patterns, not as a theory, not as speculation, but as a process already in motion. The question is no longer whether reserve currencies fail. It is how far along the cycle we are. The collapse of a reserve currency is never a mystery in hindsight. The evidence is always visible long before the outcome becomes undeniable. What makes each cycle dangerous is not ignorance, but familiarity. Empires convince themselves that history applies to others, not to them. Spain believed its silver empire would endure indefinitely. For over 3 centuries, Spanish silver coins powered global trade. They flowed from the Americas into Europe and across Asia. Spain controlled territory, resources, and trade routes. Confidence in the currency rested on that dominance. But maintaining an empire is expensive. Time 0.5s. Spain fought prolonged wars it could not afford. Government spending outpaced real economic production. To bridge the gap, the crown debased its currency. Silver coins were diluted with cheaper metals. More money entered circulation without corresponding growth in productivity. Inflation followed. Merchants noticed. Trust eroded. Once confidence weakened, the system unraveled quickly. The world did not abandon Spanish money out of ideology. It abandoned it out of necessity. The Dutch guilder followed the same trajectory. During the 17th century, the Netherlands became the financial center of the world. Amsterdam was where global trade settled. The guilder represented stability, innovation, and trust. Dutch banking practices shaped modern finance. But success bred overreach. Military conflicts multiplied. Debt expanded. Money creation replaced discipline. Inflation reduced purchasing power. Eventually, capital migrated elsewhere. The guilder did not collapse overnight. It faded as credibility declined. The British pound completed the pattern. From the early 19th century through the first half of the 20th, sterling functioned as the backbone of global trade. The British Empire spanned continents. London dominated international finance. The Bank of England set the tone for monetary policy worldwide. Yet 2 world wars shattered Britain's fiscal position. Government spending exploded. Debt accumulated faster than growth. Money printing became unavoidable. By the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944, the transition away from the pound was formalized. What followed was not immediate ruin, but a prolonged decline. By the 1970s, sterling was no longer exceptional. Britain adjusted to a reduced role. These transitions were not accidents. They were consequences of structural imbalances. Excessive money creation weakened currencies. Unsustainable debt limited flexibility. Military overextension drained resources. Manufacturing capacity declined as financial privilege replaced production. And throughout each cycle, denial delayed reform. Each society believed its dominance was permanent until it was not. This historical framework matters because it establishes context. Reserve currencies do not fail because of single events. They fail because systems become dependent on conditions that cannot persist indefinitely. When confidence breaks, it does so after long warning signals. The present moment cannot be evaluated without this lens. The United States is now exhibiting the same structural characteristics that defined every previous reserve currency decline. The parallels are not subtle. They are mechanical. The first and most visible signal is monetary expansion. In 2008, the Federal Reserve balance sheet stood below $1 trillion. Today, it exceeds $7 trillion. Trillions of dollars were created in response to financial stress, economic slowdown, and market instability. Each intervention was presented as temporary. None were reversed. Money creation became the default solution. When growth weakened, liquidity increased. When markets fell, support followed. New terms were introduced to make the process sound controlled, but the mechanism remained unchanged. More currency entered circulation without a proportional increase in real output. The result was predictable. Inflation eroded purchasing power. Prices rose not because goods became scarce, but because money became abundant. The official measurements minimized the impact, but lived experience told a different story. Housing, food, energy, healthcare, and education all absorbed the cost of expansion. Alongside monetary growth, debt accumulation accelerated. National debt surpassed $36 trillion, exceeding annual economic output. Each year, trillions more were added. Interest payments alone now consume over $1 trillion annually. This is not investment. It is maintenance. Resources are diverted to servicing past obligations rather than building future capacity. As interest rates remain elevated, these costs increase automatically. At a certain scale, debt ceases to be a tool and becomes a constraint. History shows that once debt servicing crowds out essential spending, options narrow rapidly. Time, 0.5s. Governments can default, impose austerity, or inflate the currency. Default destroys credibility. Austerity triggers social and political instability. Inflation is less visible, easier to implement, and therefore repeatedly chosen. It functions as an indirect tax, reducing real wealth without explicit legislation. This pattern is not ideological, it is administrative. These pressures intensify when combined with global military commitments. Maintaining influence through force requires continuous expenditure. Overseas bases, long conflicts, and security guarantees consume resources that do not generate economic return. Britain faced this dilemma after the Second World War. Despite financial exhaustion, it attempted to sustain imperial reach. The strain accelerated decline. The United States now carries similar obligations across dozens of countries, funding dominance through borrowing rather than surplus. When monetary expansion, debt dependency, and military overreach operate simultaneously, structural fragility increases. None of these factors alone cause collapse. Together, they create conditions where stability depends on confidence rather than fundamentals. Once confidence weakens, time, 0.3s. The system becomes vulnerable to rapid shifts. Another critical signal appears in the erosion of productive capacity. Reserve currency nations tend to shift away from manufacturing as financial dominance grows. When the world accepts a currency by default, production becomes optional. Imports are easily financed. Consumption expands faster than output. Over time, the economy reorganizes around services, finance, and debt rather than tangible goods. This transition feels efficient during expansion, but it creates dependence. The United States once functioned as the primary manufacturing engine of the global economy. It produced steel, machinery, vehicles, electronics, and industrial equipment at scale. Exports exceeded imports. Trade surpluses reinforced monetary strength. That structure no longer exists. Manufacturing has been outsourced. Supply chains now depend on foreign production. Trade deficits persist year after year. The gap is filled not with goods, but with dollars. This imbalance is sustainable only while the currency retains reserve status. Other nations accept dollars in exchange for real output because those dollars function as global settlement assets. When confidence declines, the equation reverses. Goods are no longer exchanged for currency without hesitation. Production capacity becomes relevant again. Countries that hollowed out their industrial base discover they cannot easily replace what was lost. Denial plays a decisive role at this stage. Populations living inside reserve currency systems rarely perceive decline while it unfolds. Stability feels permanent. Financial markets function. Daily life continues. The assumption of exceptionalism overrides historical precedent. Spain, the Netherlands, and Britain all experienced this psychological phase. Warning signs were dismissed as temporary distortions rather than structural signals. Today, similar patterns are visible. Discussions of reserve currency vulnerability are often treated as fringe speculation. Confidence is reinforced by short-term indicators and comparative strength rather than absolute fundamentals. Yet history demonstrates that dominance erodes quietly before it disappears visibly. By the time decline is widely acknowledged, adaptation options have narrowed. Compounding this denial are external shifts in global alignment. Bilateral trade agreements increasingly bypass the dollar. Central banks diversify reserves. Gold accumulation replaces currency exposure. Alternative settlement systems emerge gradually, not as declarations, but as practical adjustments. These changes do not signal immediate collapse. They indicate preparation. Reserve currency transitions do not occur in a single moment. They unfold through long periods of overlap, hesitation, and gradual substitution. What matters is not the speed of change, but its direction. Once alternatives become viable, dependence weakens. When dependence weakens, confidence erodes. And when confidence erodes, the system accelerates toward its next phase. When reserve currency status weakens, the consequences extend beyond finance. The first impact is monetary. Dollars that once circulated globally begin to return home. Foreign reserves, trade balances, and settlement flows no longer require long-term dollar holdings. This reversal increases domestic money supply without increasing domestic production. Inflation accelerates not because policy changes overnight, but because the global function of the currency changes. At the same time, borrowing costs adjust. Demand for government debt depends on confidence in the currency that services it. When reserve status erodes, that demand weakens. Higher interest rates become necessary to attract buyers. Rising rates increase debt servicing costs, slow investment, and strain financial institutions. Credit-dependent sectors contract. Asset prices adjust downward. Economic stress spreads unevenly, but persistently. Standards of living respond accordingly. A currency that once purchased global output at favorable terms loses purchasing power. Imports become more expensive. Choice narrows. Consumption adjusts to constraints rather than preference. These shifts do not feel dramatic at first. They appear as gradual pressure. Time 0.5s. Over time, cumulative loss becomes visible. Social and political stability are also affected. Inflation reduces savings. Fixed incomes lose value. Economic frustration searches for explanations. Historical precedent shows that currency instability often precedes social polarization. The issue is not ideology, but stress. Systems under pressure amplify conflict. Central banks recognize these risks. Their challenge is not ignorance, but limitation. Tightening monetary conditions stabilizes currency, but destabilizes markets. Continued expansion stabilizes markets, but weakens currency. Each choice imposes cost. Historically, institutions choose delay. They manage decline incrementally, extending the system rather than resetting it. This strategy postpones disruption, but increases eventual adjustment. History offers no examples of painless reserve currency transitions. What it provides instead are patterns. Gradual erosion followed by acceleration. Confidence supported until alternatives mature. Stability maintained until it cannot be. The timing varies. The structure does not. As pressures accumulate, policymakers face a narrowing corridor. Every response addresses one risk while amplifying another. Raising interest rates slows inflation, but threatens financial stability. Lowering rates supports markets, but accelerates currency debasement. Fiscal restraint preserves credibility, but destabilizes social systems dependent on continuous spending. Expansion maintains short-term calm at the cost of long-term erosion. These are not failures of competence. They are constraints imposed by scale. History shows that once a reserve currency reaches this stage, decline becomes managed rather than prevented. Central authorities attempt to smooth transition. Time 0.3s contain volatility and preserve confidence for as long as possible. The objective shifts from correction to control. This period can last years. It often appears stable. Yet beneath the surface, dependency deepens and resilience weakens. External developments matter most during this phase. Alternative trade arrangements gain traction. Regional settlement systems reduce reliance on a single currency. Commodity producers diversify payment structures. Central banks rebalance reserves toward assets perceived as politically neutral. Each step is small. Together, they reduce marginal demand for the reserve currency. Once that demand softens, feedback loops accelerate adjustment. The transition does not require universal abandonment. It requires only sufficient substitution to alter flow dynamics. When fewer dollars are needed abroad, excess supply concentrates domestically. Inflation becomes structural rather than cyclical. Confidence erodes gradually until a threshold is crossed. At that point, policy responses lose effectiveness. Tools that once stabilized markets amplify instability instead. What distinguishes reserve currency decline from ordinary recession is permanence. Cycles recover. Structural shifts time 0.5s. Purchasing power lost through currency debasement is not restored. Standards of living adjust downward. Economic roles reconfigure. Influence contracts. These changes occur unevenly and unpredictably, but their direction remains consistent across historical cases. This is why timelines are uncertain, but trajectories are clear. Decline unfolds slowly, then accelerates. The early phase is characterized by debate and denial. The later phase is defined by adaptation. Those who recognize patterns early have flexibility. Those who wait for confirmation confront constraints. The purpose of studying reserve currency history is not prediction. It is orientation. Systems behave according to incentives and limits. When those limits are reached, outcomes converge regardless of intent. Understanding where a system sits within its cycle provides clarity without speculation. This is the point at which every reserve currency story converges. Not with collapse, but with transition. Not with certainty of timing, but with inevitability of adjustment. The question history repeatedly leaves unanswered is not whether change occurs, but how prepared societies are when it arrives. As the transition unfolds, the final phase is defined not by surprise, but by realization. The warning signs that once appeared abstract become practical constraints. Inflation no longer feels temporary. Credit no longer feels accessible. Stability becomes conditional. At this stage, narratives shift. Confidence is no longer defended through reassurance, but through explanation. Institutions emphasize resilience, adaptation, and patience rather than permanence. Historical precedent shows that individuals and systems respond differently at this point. Some adjust early, diversifying, exposure, and reducing dependency on a single structure. Others delay, assuming recovery will resemble past cycles. The distinction is not intelligence, but timing. Reserve currency transitions punish concentration and reward flexibility. They do not require collapse to impose cost. They impose cost through erosion. What ultimately defines the outcome is not policy intent, but arithmetic. Debt servicing scales independently of political preference. Monetary expansion produces predictable effects regardless of justification. External actors respond to incentives, not assurances. When alternatives exist, reliance declines. When reliance declines, dominance fades. This process is gradual until it is not. History offers no examples of reserve currencies that reversed decline once structural thresholds were crossed. Adjustments occurred. New systems emerged. Standards stabilized at lower equilibrium levels. Influence reorganized. The world did not end. It changed. Those transitions were uneven, disruptive, and often misunderstood while they occurred. The purpose of examining this pattern is not to forecast dates or engineer certainty. It is to recognize position. Systems move through stages, whether acknowledged or not. Awareness does not stop transition, but it changes response. The earlier patterns are understood. The broader the range of available options remains. Every reserve currency story ends the same way, but each generation believes its circumstances are unique. History suggests otherwise. The variables differ. The structure repeats. What remains unresolved is not whether adjustment will occur, but how deliberately it will be navigated.